IVM.
Agriculture employs more than 50% of India's workforce. That sounds like a cartoonish, false statistic, particularly in a population of 1.3 billion people. But it's true. While countries like China have relentlessly urbanized over the last decades, agriculture and rural agriculture remain a key piece of India's socioeconomic fabric and of the fabric of other countries and regions like it, like Indonesia and sub-Saharan Africa.
Even with the rapid urbanization in these regions over the next decades, the world's low and middle-income countries will likely house a huge rural agri-dependent population through 2050. It's the backdrop against which new and exciting sectors like the alternative protein ecosystem must grow. And it can be a bane or a boon for entrepreneurs looking to enter an exciting new sector in regions where so much attention and investment is overwhelmingly and rightfully focused on other areas. The lack of momentum can prove crippling.
While the global plant-based meat, egg, and dairy sector has gone from strength to strength in 2019, aspiring plant-based entrepreneurs in India have been deprived of suitable ingredients, product development expertise, and fundamental infrastructure. The lack of this enabling ecosystem hobbles entrepreneurs. It takes away the opportunity to shape their destiny, build world-class companies, and launch delicious foods better for human and planetary health. India's driven, ingenious, resourceful entrepreneurs deserve far better.
And that means building up an ecosystem of support at the intersection of business, science, and policy, including, crucially, early-stage investment and hand-holding to nurture young and innovative businesses. It's what is known as catalytic capital, and it's an essential tool to bridge those gaps and achieve impact in the nascent stages of a sector. Today's guest on Feeding 10 Billion embodies that necessary spirit of ecosystem building and catalytic capital perfectly. Hemendra Mathur is a friend of GFI India, a venture partner with Bharat Innovation Fund, and a stalwart in the Indian agriculture and investing landscape. He has over 20 years of experience in venture capital, private equity, management consulting, and investment banking, and an unparalleled investing history across sectors in the agricultural and food supply chain. Hemendra in his career has worked with SEAF, Yes Bank, Rabobank, KSA Technopak, and ORG Mark Nielsen. He's a management graduate from IIM Ahmedabad and an agricultural engineer from Rajasthan Agricultural University.
To sum up, Hemendra is quite possibly the one investor and mentor most well-networked within India's agri-supply ecosystem. I'm Varun Deshpande, Managing Director at the Good Food Institute India.
And I'm Ramya Ramurthy, Communication Specialist at the Good Food Institute India. And you're listening to Feeding 10 Billion. Let's dive right in. Hemendra, how hard has it been for you to incorporate technology into Indian agriculture, given that a lot of our issues actually go beyond technology into small holding structures, poor farmer incomes due to lack of built-up value chains, especially in indigenous crops, and other such issues that seemingly pertain more to policy bottlenecks rather than technology per se?
Yeah, Ramya. So it's a good question, and I would say technology is extremely important, but I think it is incidental to the solution that are being developed for smallholder farmers. So you can very well have a non-tech solution to solve for farmer problems. For example, during these COVID times, many farmer groups got together in places like Bangalore, Gurgaon, to sell their produce, like mango, grape, directly to the farmers, without any intermediation. And there was no tech involved. So in a way, for the first time, I saw a complete farm-to-fork solution in practice. The reason tech becomes important, that it definitely drives scale. And secondly, it also brings much needed data and process orientation to the sector. So that's why if you look at tech, it becomes central, particularly if you look at it from an investor perspective, right? And I would say any tech which is used in agricultural sector has to improve farm economics. It may be direct impact or it may be indirect impact. Even a poor farmer, a small farmer, or a marginal farmer, I would say is willing to pay for the tech solutions as long as he can see a direct impact on the farm economics in the very first crop season, right? And when I say farm economics, there are essentially three dimensions to it. The first and foremost, more income in the hand of farmer, which could be due to better productivity, better prices, or diversification of income sources. And in some case, even assured income is good enough for the farmers. In fact, a lot of farm-to-fork startups procuring from the farmers essentially assure transfer into their bank accounts within 24 to 48 hours. That itself is a huge benefit to the farmers. Second dimension is around input cost. How do you reduce the cost of inputs, be it seeds, fertilizers, machinery, agrochemicals? Usually farmer has a sort of a gut feel in terms of how much different kind of inputs have to be used. So if you can move it away from a gut-based sort of system to more science-based or data-based system, it can definitely help farmer to optimize the input cost. Last but not the least, de-risking farming could be another way where you can improve farm economics, and that essentially means reducing the cost of capital to farmer and improving the access to institutional credit. In my calculation, the weighted average cost of capital in Indian farming at let's say an average of 1 hectare farmland is more like 18 to 20%. And if you compare that with the return on investment for the farmer, my guess is it is between 11 to 12%. So essentially, any tech solution who's trying to solve for it, any fintech solution in agriculture should essentially try and reduce this anomaly to make farm economics better. On the policy framework, yes, I think policy has a huge role to play. And many of our acts in the agricultural sector, like Seed Act, Fertilizer Act, Insecticide Act, many of them are like more than 50-year-old. It's time we relook at them from the lens of innovations, trying to integrate benefits which can accrue to farmers by adopting some of these innovations. So yeah, I think that's my view. Of course, there are a lot of policy reform which have happened in the COVID times. What we expected to happen over the next few years happened in last 45 days. Like, government removed EC Act, Mandi Act got modified. But I think there is enough scope even now, creating new data policy framework, creating new models for market access. And there's also potentially a lot of reforms needed to make the input supply chain more transparent and smoother for a lot of tech solution to reach out to the farmers.
That's a fascinating point, Hemendra, with respect to what's changed so rapidly during the time of COVID-19, because we're in a time of crisis and a lot of things can change very rapidly. I want to put a pin in that and come back to that later. But on the subject of innovation, like you said, let's switch track a little bit and talk about the alternative protein sector in which GFI operates, also known as the smart protein sector, that is plant-based, fermentation-based, and cultivated meat, eggs, and dairy. Now, we've talked in the past about how you need sort of catalytic capital to build this sector. What that means is patient, sometimes massive investment, but usually coming in at a stage where people would otherwise not be able to access capital. The current investor ecosystem or even government or other public institutions may find this to be in short supply for entrepreneurs, especially during this time when the world is likely to slide into an economic recession, but also generally because little is known about our sector generally. So how do we ensure that despite all of these hurdles, we still build on the kind of entrepreneur, investor, incubator, government ecosystem in India, despite of this awareness problem, this lack of capital problem? How do we bring in that catalytic capital even in these times?
A very good question, Varun, and absolutely very pertinent in the current context. So in my experience, whether it is alternative proteins, whether it is agri-tech, or any emerging sunrise sector, let's say electrical vehicles or clean tech solutions, I think a lot of these require a lot of heavy lifting. And for any of these models to become mainstream and scale, I have a theory that you need Panch Tattva, as we call in our Hindu mythology. And what are these Panch Tattvas for me from these emerging sector perspective is essentially entrepreneurs, government, industry, incubation and R&D, and last but not the least, investor. I think these are 5 critical elements who have to come together. You need high quality entrepreneurs, you need a critical mass of startups, right? You need a lot of policy initiatives, because typically policy doesn't take account of these innovations, whatever which is there right now. So you need a new policy framework. You need significant industry participation as customer, as mentors, as drivers, as adopters. You need incubation support essentially for bringing the network to the startup so that the scaling is faster. And investor you need for capital. So I think this is extremely critical for bringing all this together. In my experience, mostly in agri-tech, it needs a bit of evangelization. You have to look at models which are going to work in next 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. So essentially, you need deep industry expertise and lot of sort of focused approach to make it happen. I think one example which we have on hand, the way iSpirit evangelized India's tech, and it kind of got developed into such a solid platform for digital payments and multiple application. I think we should learn from that, how that happened, and which is essentially bringing all the ecosystem together. So I personally believe if we have to drive these changes, if we have to make these new business models successful, it's unlikely to come from typical hierarchical driven organization structures, right? You need flexible organization structures and talent which have the ability to connect the dots, right? And if everything start coming together, you see some inflection points, right? So let's say in agri-tech, if you ask me with my experience in last 10 years, of course, initially it was a lot of hard work. That's a 2010 to 2015. They were like maybe 50, 100 startups who were trying to sort of solve a lot of challenges and provide a viable business model for the valuation players. But it wasn't getting enough traction. What happened then that a critical mass of talented, very smart entrepreneurs got into the ecosystem. So I would say that was 2015 to 2017 phase. We saw sort of maybe more than 100 entrepreneurs who came with very strong tech background, with a lot of commitment and passion. Policy started to recognize such startups for a change. And investors, initially, of course, the whole investments was coming from sector focused funds and impact funds and incubation money, etc. But let's say the next inflection point happened in 2019 when a lot of mainstream investors also recognized the importance of the sector, and we kind of saw about, let's say, $300 million flowing into the sector in last 15 months out of the cumulative $500 to $550 million which has come into the sector so far, right? And last but not the least, which I am seeing, let's say now and maybe in next few months and maybe next couple of years, is adoption of these models by a large section of farming population. So if you ask me that out of 150 million farmers, how many million farmers have actually benefited from agri-tech? Of course, there is no sort of research and study given this number, but my guess is probably still less than 10%, right? So how to get that penetration going, I think, is the next big challenge and probably an inflection point we could see next few years. And I'm also very optimistic in some of these solutions going global, right? Which can sort of probably make Indian agri-tech a sort of hub of innovation for the rest of the world. So yeah, I think it's a journey. For agri-tech, it was 10 years. But I can tell you, if there was not enough catalytic effort put in by a lot of players, including investors, few bureaucrats, some mentors, some incubators, it wouldn't have happened in 10 years. It would have probably taken 15 odd years or maybe 20 years, you never know. So I'm very happy the kind of effort GFI is putting in building an alternative protein ecosystem. I think you need that kind of effort to bring all these elements together. And I'm very hopeful with that kind of effort put in, probably what could take maybe 10, 15 years in India for alternative protein markets to develop may happen in next 5 years. So I feel very optimistic about it. The fact that Indian startup Evo got a check, from reputed investors in last week or so proves the point that we do have a talent, but it needs to be nurtured properly.
Yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to say. Thank you so much, Hemendra. I really appreciate that. The Panch Tattva, or 5 elements, actually various elements of the innovation ecosystem that can be catalytic to building it up from the ground up, really are coming into place over the last year or so, and perhaps more work will be needed over the next years in doing so. But we're seeing some activity, particularly on the investment side and the large corporations getting involved, which is giving us a lot of encouragement for the future. And I do think that there's more to delve into in terms of how investors can come in a way that handholds the ecosystem and brings it up, just as you've done and other investors like, let's say, Omnivore have done for agri-tech in the past?
Yeah, I think investors do have a big role. And very frankly, from an investor perspective, in sectors which are emerging, it is not just the capital which goes into the company. I think you need to bring in a lot of expertise. You need to bring in a lot of network, your ability to guide the team, strategize, brainstorm, sort of make sure that they don't make mistakes early in their journey, how to figure out synergies between your portfolio, between various startups, between corporates and startups, between FQ and startups. So it's very, very active investing. To me, probably I get 15 calls a day from various startups. Of course, not all of them are in my portfolio, but I think that is the kind of engagement you need. It's not about quarterly board meetings and monthly compliances and annual reporting and etc. etc. That of course is critical from a governance perspective, but I think the kind of commitment that you need as an investor in a sector which is just about to take off is much more than just putting capital into the company.
Absolutely, Hemendra. And one of the things we chatted about recently when we talked about this sector and you were thinking with your investor hat on, you said that even if you were to identify the right startups, which would be in early stage in this nascent sector, due diligence or product validation tends to be tough given the hard science that's backing this food technology. And you mentioned that if an investor doesn't have that kind of background, then evaluating your investment or evaluating where the next breakthrough is going to emerge from can be quite tough. So how do you think we can conquer this issue?
Oh, very good question, Raman. I think to me, this requires tons of effort from all of us to make it happen. And since, for example, from Bharat also, we do deep tech investing across sectors. I think one challenge that we always have is the validation of tech. The fact that it is deep tech, there is a lot of intellectual property, there are patents, there's a lot of application of deep sciences, right? Be it in advanced materials or in drug discovery or in AR, VR, or let's say the AI ML models, right? How do you figure it out that they are really deep, proprietary, defensible, right? Of course, the most obvious way of checking that out is anyone willing to pay for it, right? So you end up sort of, figuring out where these guys are selling, what kind of premium are they getting vis-a-vis rest of the sort of competitors, right? So those are the sort of various obvious checks. But let's say if I have to invest in a product development stage when there are no revenues, I have to invest in a pre-revenue company, right? How do I figure out that this is a great solution? It's going to create disruption. It's going to scale, right? So I think that expertise probably exists, but we don't know where it exists. My guess is it does exist with some of the domain experts or some of the institutions who are working on it. For example, let's take agri-biotech, right? ICAR, Indian Council of Agricultural Research, has so many institutions, so many streams which is around agri-biotech, right? I think they are the right ones to comment that how good is a variety of hybrid seed, for example. What is the likely germination rate? What is the likely yield, right? Unfortunately, that scientific community and this entrepreneurial community and the investor community, are siloed. We need to figure out how do we build bridges or a mechanism where I know that if I have to check on this particular aspect of tech, this is the person or this is the institution I should be talking to. I think that mechanism is kind of lacking and we need to work that hard on it. And it's also vice versa. A lot of very interesting research and patents are lying within public institutions. And fortunately, because there's no entrepreneurial sort of mindset or energy, they are not able to commercialize those. So I think the problem is also at the end of these institutions who are sitting on some very good products, but they're not able to figure out how to make it big, how to commercialize, how to get it to the market. So we need to solve for it. I think from a sector perspective, each one of us, be it alternative proteins, you need to figure out what are those institutions who are doing some interesting work. You have to go out to them and say, guys, we want to put this platform. Would you like to participate? And it's increase that engagement essentially between the guys who understand the science of it and the guys who are trying to commercialize it, right? So I think there's a lot of hard work needed. Look at the Silicon Valley models, look at the US VC ecosystem. There's so many deals which happen pre-revenue. The deep tech ecosystem is at a very different level. And I think the universities in US have played a big role. In fact, a lot of these research, which is becoming $1 billion sort of startups, of post commercialization, have come from such institutions, right? So they've got it right. I think we need to sort of figure that out. We need a few case studies. We need a few success stories for institutions also to feel sort of good about it. So yes, I think that's a vacuum right now. We need to work a little harder to solve for it. Hopefully we can solve it in next few months or years.
Yeah, Hemendra, thank you so much. That makes a lot of sense, especially in the context of my next question. So institutions have been crucial to the establishment of this sector overseas. So you mentioned that many of these companies, Beyond Meat, came out of research at different places, Stanford, Missouri, a bunch of universities that had deep ties to crop science and to biotech. In India as well, we're looking to establish a lot of expertise within these universities so that they are a cradle of innovation for our sector in India. Of course, that overlaps with government interest as well. So the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, which is a central government body, it also has about 40 labs, many of whom we're already working with. But they control the budgets, and there's a great deal of power that they hold towards what those institutions work on. So when we're talking about the role of institutions in the growth of alternative protein, what should our kind of policy and scientific roadmap for this sector look like if we want to be at the forefront of this revolution on par with Singapore or Israel or the United States?
I think I can tell you from my experience in agri-tech, probably there are some learnings for alternative proteins. I think one big learning that I have had working with the government, be it at the federal level or the state level, is to move from concept to proof of concept. You go to the government and say, hey guys, this is what's happening in Israel and Singapore or in US. It's probably worth exploring in India. That's one way to say it. And second, to say, guys, we have this startup coming out of so-and-so university. They have done a great job in building a model around plant proteins. Let's say sort of, extremely good for, let's say, undernourished children, or this can be consumed in multiple formats. This is very affordable, stuff like that. I think the storylines are very different when you're trying to sell a concept vis-a-vis you're trying to sell something which is more real, right? So I think that's one learning, that whenever we approach policymakers, we have live examples to talk about so that there is more weight to what we're trying to achieve, right? I think second learning for me that, policy has a huge role to play. So we should avoid any possible confrontational modes. Of course, there could be debates, what's right, what's not right. There could be difference in priorities, etc. But I think how to sort of, dovetail innovation with policy is something which we need to figure out. Any innovation to me in a country like India cannot be divorced from government policy. So you have to accept it. You have to find champions, be it an institution or be it a government or be it a ministry or be it a state government. You have to find champions within the government who's willing to take your cause to the right levels, because you also need a lot of guidance how innovation can drive policy or how policy can integrate innovation. So I have used it very effectively. I can tell you in the last 10 to 15 years without naming those bureaucrats. There are some really smart bureaucrats and they are willing to listen to you. You have to tell them the bigger picture and you have to be frankly neutral. It shouldn't be supporting a type of startup or a type of industry or a company. You have to talk about the larger good when you're talking to the government, right? So I think that is the approach I have used effectively. And then also sort of, using the right themes. Let's say alternative protein, if I have to take it to, let's say, chief secretary at a state level, and I say you guys have a lot of natural resources or you are growing so-and-so crop, and, there's a huge potential of sort of putting an R&D facility to convert that into a processing facility and then potentially extract proteins out of it, right? He said, okay, great model, but what isn't it for me in my state? So I think you need to build the right themes around your story. So for example, if I have to approach it, I'll say, this is all about affordability. This is all about increasing the ability of consumers to buy more right proteins. The story has to be around nutrition, how it can solve for a large section of malnourished population. Post-COVID, immunity is going to be a big theme, right? We are already, hearing about so many products which we haven't explored, from Ayurveda, from herbal medicine, etc., which can potentially be huge immunity builders, right? So can I build my alternative protein story and link it to the immunity through, of course, some sort of scientific facts and research? Then we should talk about public health. We should talk about the state or the country becoming global hub for innovations, bringing more FDI, more investments, etc. So I think you have to also play it right when you're talking to the policymakers. And these are some of my learnings, I'm sure. And I'm personally a big sort of advocate of alternative proteins. I think that is the way forward for a country like India if you have to solve for a lot of problems that we are facing on the health front, etc. So it has a lot of strong points. We probably need to sharpen the edges. We need to figure out how to build more case studies, more examples. How do we crowd in more startups? How do we sort of draw learning from other countries and make a holistic pitch to policymakers to take it to the next level?
Thanks, Hemendra. On that note, we'll take a short break, but stay tuned. We'll be back with more of Feeding 10 Billion.
Hey everybody, welcome to another awesome week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you're not following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Paytm Money and Intel. Their support makes this content possible. So, been a really exciting week on the network this week. We've had some really cool stuff. My old friend Vivek Lad was on Storytellers and Storysellers. Definitely do check that out. On Cyrus Said, we had Ashwin Sanghi on Thursday's episode, and Cyrus and myself did a cock and bull, just the two of us. That was fun as well on Monday. Do check that out. Masaba was on Advertising is Dead, which was another really, really strong episode from Varun. And on the sports front, both Edges and Sledges, Football Shitball had some really fun episodes. That's the Football Twaddle. Do check those out as well. And if you haven't been paying attention and you haven't been listening to Smile India in these times, I don't know why you aren't. It's the most uplifting show that you could listen to. It's a short, bite-sized piece of really positive things that happen in India. Do definitely check that out. And with that, let's get you back to your show.
Welcome back to this episode of Feeding 10 Billion. We have Hemendra Mathur with us. Hemendra, you've written extensively about the Zomatoization or the Oyoization of the food technology sector in India, and also mentioned that food tech is often mistakenly just conflated with just food delivery tech in India. But we have a chance to expand on that with our sector. And one of the key pathways for the alternative protein or smart protein sector in the B2C model would have been the Zomatos and Swiggies as well as the food service sector overall. But given that they are currently facing a massive slump and it's going to take a huge capital infusion or huge effort or huge government support to start again, do you think we in the smart protein sector need to be rethinking the pathways to consumers in India to focus on retail, or maybe focus completely on B2B collaborations for now?
Yes, Ramya. So you're right. Any B2C model is more capital intensive. For example, any downstream model where you want to reach out to, let's say, 1 million consumer, take capital to the tune of $1 billion, right? And essentially that also happens when you give them some sort of convenience or you follow a discount strategy to reach their kind of scale. So that's why these models are extremely capital intensive, essentially to drive scale at any cost. So I think, in my view, these models will see a shift post-COVID because capital will come at a premium. And that's where I think the B2B models definitely are going to become more prevalent. I can tell you in agri-tech, for example, though everyone says that reaching out to millions of farmers is a bit of a challenge, but a lot of startups have been able to crack it through B2B approach. And when I say B2B, essentially the first B is of course startup, and the second B is either a corporate or a farmer producer organization, or it could be even a village level entrepreneurs who's working with the farmer, right? So I think that is one mode of taking your solution to thousands and millions of farmers at a relatively low cost. So let's say, if I have to take names, let's say startup like Dehat, who has about, let's say, close to 500,000 farmers on the platform. They have done it extremely successfully using a franchisee model, right? And if you look at the funding that they have raised, including the last round, is probably maybe around $20 odd million. So that's extremely efficient use of capital to me. So clearly, I see that post-COVID we'll see a pivot towards more B2B models, which are more capital efficient and which can ultimately drive sustainability, not necessarily scale, in the, let's say, 3 to 5 years time. And I would also say that, the B2B models in general, to begin with, is not a bad idea, because you have much more ability to pivot your models. You have more ability to experiment vis-a-vis when you go directly to the consumer, and in some cases it may become very difficult to do the course correction if something has gone wrong. So yes, we should definitely be exploring B2B route when it comes to alternative proteins vis-a-vis a direct to consumer route.
Now, as far as COVID-19 is concerned, Hemendra, one of our key focus areas is, of course, the environment and tackling climate change. But in the current situation, of course, priorities have shifted for government, for private industry, for philanthropy, for civil society as a whole. So how does the current situation affect climate priorities and the urgency of balancing COVID-19 versus what's coming in the future with climate change, especially for our agri-food supply chain?
Yeah, so I think climate risks are there. They are increasing by the day. In fact, this is one of those situations which is sort of a crisis in making if we don't address it now. So again, look at, for example, water consumption in Indian agriculture. 80% of the water which is available in the country is used for agriculture. Out of that, almost 2/3 of the water is being drawn from the ground. And there's a study which says that in the next 10 years, 50% of our bore wells will go dry. So that's a significant challenge because water is so core to the agriculture, right? Likewise, look at the soil health. Unfortunately, because of a lot of policy issues, we have much more nitrogen in the soil vis-a-vis potassium and phosphorus and other micronutrients, which is kind of reducing the ability of soil to be more productive, right? So that's another challenge in making. Look at the population of honeybees in India. Again, we don't have the numbers, but the general trend is it's reducing at a very fast rate because of course, extreme temperatures or high usage of pesticides. And whether we like it or not, we need honeybees for all the cross-pollinated crops. 90% or 80% of the cross-pollination happens with bees. So if we don't have enough of them, productivity in many crops, many fruits like apples, etc., may go down drastically. So I think it's high time we recognize the challenges which are going to come. The repercussions of that can be disastrous, much more than what we are seeing challenges which is coming out of current COVID crisis. The sustainability of agriculture as well as the food supply chain will become a big question mark. And we definitely have more people to feed in, right? Our population is going to go up to 10 billion by 2050. In India alone, we'll probably have more than 1.5 billion people to feed. So it's a very challenging situation. We need to put in a lot of effort to support innovations for climate resilient agriculture, be it around efficient use of water for irrigation, be it around soil diagnostic, which can help you apply optimal dosage of fertilizer rather than just broadcasting urea on the soil. We need to be measuring weather parameters. We need to be modeling the probability of pest attacks so that we can effectively apply pesticides and insecticides when needed. So yeah, I think we need to be looking at innovations and supporting them through a climate lens. I personally see that what impact money has done over the last couple of decades in many of the sectors like healthcare, education, agriculture. It's time that we start building a pool of climate capital, which kind of addresses the issues which support the innovation that we need to make it more resilient and to make our food supply chain and agriculture sustainable for a long period of time.
Absolutely, Hemendra. And obviously the feeding 10 billion theme that sort of overarches our entire podcast series brings us to the point of nutrition and also higher farmer incomes by creating end-to-end agricultural value chains in indigenous Indian crops. These are two of our key mission objectives in India at GFI India. And at ThinkAg, you're focused on, like you said, building a more resilient agricultural ecosystem, particularly for climate resilience. So what do you think is the role that alternative protein or smart protein can play in these specific program areas according to you?
Yeah, I think one is, of course, look at the indigenous crops which are not being explored. So just to give an example, if you look at cattle feed category, most of the protein is derived from soya, right? And that's true for poultry feed also. But we have such a large variety of oil seeds like surf, cotton seed, rapeseed, castor seeds, all seed. I think all of them have enough protein in it. The challenge is how to extract it effectively, how to de-stabilize anti-nutritional factors so that these proteins become good for animal consumption and hopefully for human consumption also. So I think we need to be supporting all the crops which can become potential sources of protein. I'm sure you must have looked at other categories like algae, pea protein. Frankly, maybe I'm not aware, but there are not too many examples of startups who are trying to work on sort of protein extraction from some of these categories. So how do we again sort of try and build critical mass in all this? How do we bring in more public research, institutional role so that there's less duplication of work? And from a GFI perspective, because you understand what has happened overseas, in a way, it's probably good that we are laggard in some of these areas. We have probably a lot to learn from other countries, how those ecosystems got developed. So probably there are a lot of learnings which you can bring as an institution to the startups and to the wider ecosystem in general, in terms of having a more sharper focus, in terms of building very clear path to scale, right? So that's my thinking. One another point that I have on alternative proteins that probably in India, I'm not sure whether a meat substitution strategy of positioning is good for alternative protein because our per capita consumption of meat is probably still very low, right? So, of course, I totally understand concerns around animal welfare, etc., and sort of move away the focus from that. But having said that, developing protein from sources which are not being explored to cater to the protein demand of the country. If I remember the data correctly, the per capita consumption per day is about 10 grams, where we need 60 grams, right? So it's a huge difference between how much we should be consuming and what are we eating on in our daily diets. So I think that positioning to me sounds very, very strong. Building protein for the masses, building affordable protein, building protein products which are easily digestible and can drive your immunity, etc. I think is a very strong platform to me. In addition to the substitution of meats and sort of other proteins coming out of milk, etc., which is kind of a commonplace in some of the Western economies. So yeah, that's one thought process that I have, but you may want to correct me if that's not right.
No, that makes sense to a certain degree, Hemendra. So with respect to our specific mission at GFI India, what we're seeing is rising meat consumption with rising incomes. That's a proven result in all countries anywhere in the world, right? So even in India, you have 71% of the population self-identifying as non-vegetarian. And of course, that definition includes eggs as non-vegetarian. But the point is that generally we are not as vegetarian as the world seems to think. And the strictures of religion are not as strong on people's consumption. So people are not going to stay away from non-vegetarian food. And we don't want to advocate for them to do that. We want to give them an option that allows them to make a simple switch rather than a sacrifice. And crucially, like you said, provides them with that tasty, nutritious protein at a large scale. I also want to react to the point of scale that you made because I think it's absolutely crucial. What's happening in international countries, even with these novel protein sources that might be indigenous to India, in fact, with the Just Egg, for example, made from mung beans, and other people in different countries looking at lentils and pulses, we run the risk of being a laggard on all of those approaches that can really drive a lot of income to our farmers and create a lot of manufacturing and processing jobs on the ground in India. And we really need to move quickly with those institutions, with that entire ecosystem in order to make that possible. So whether it's characterizing different strains of pulses to figure out what is best, characterizing different strains of microalgae, as you said, and different other protein sources to figure out what's best to make innovative new food products, and then actually figuring out how to extract protein, like you said, how to process them, how to create delicious food products from them. I think there's a long way to go, but we have to really move quickly if we're going to deliver that value to India. As far as building that ecosystem is concerned, I really want to dive a little deeper on the Think Ag ecosystem because I think it's really unique and interesting. So you've been, part of the founding team at Think Ag. And what you're doing is building a unique environment to scale up innovation where entrepreneurs have the opportunity to partner with large corporations to bring their solutions to a wider swath of people. So you're organizing roundtables, you're building strategic partnerships between, let's say, startups and large corporations. It's all very impressive stuff. What has been the biggest hurdle when it comes to building this kind of ecosystem? Like, are Indian corporations ready to embrace innovation, which might be inherently risky? Is it part of their DNA or does it come outside that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's been a fascinating journey for us since the time we launched ThinkAg. It's about 2 years old now. It was a lot of heavy lifting initially, but we saw that there's a gap. Of course, the biggest concern for any startup usually is fundraising and get the investors on board and have capital to grow. But I think growth needs other important dimensions as well, which is essentially connecting with corporates and industry, figuring out a way to prototype your innovation and taking it to commercialization. And that's the gap that we saw at when we launched ThinkAg. No one is doing it. Can we do some catalytic effort, as we discussed, in making that happen? So yes, it was tough initially. We had to go to multiple corporates, tell them, guys, this is the platform we're launching. Would you help us? Would you support us? So I would say initially there was some bit of skepticism in terms of whether such kind of platform is required and what it will do. But I think over a period of time, we have been able to prove that it works. So we have multiple ways of engaging with corporates. We have more than 15 plus corporates who are on the platform. What we do from time to time is to bring together curated startups with each corporate and figure out what are the pain areas which corporate is facing, which a particular type of startup can solve. And not just bring them together, but also conceive a pilot and see how it goes. So I call it more like a PPP approach. So PPP approach is essentially piloting to taking to a project stage to a partnership stage, right? So how do you develop that sort of model is extremely critical. And I think it's very important on both the sides, from corporate side as well as startup side, to set the expectations right? For example, a corporate should not be treating startups like any other vendor. It can't work that way. They are still evolving. The solution may not be 100% there. They may be 80% there. But they need to be fine-tuned with guidance from the corporate. So I think they need to have that perspective that this solution will take some time to mature, but when it matures, will be extremely useful for them, right? I think likewise, startups also have to be very clear in terms of what they're promising. I have seen cases where they overpromise the solution, or they take product to the market when it's not ready, and it kind of creates doubts in the mind of the corporate that whether it's going to work or not. And as ThinkAg, we try to fine-tune those expectations on both the ends. It needs a bit of hand-holding and education, but it works perfectly. I am sure we need multiple such platforms. It has been fantastic experience. We are also using this platform now for knowledge building, for driving some thought leadership. So I feel this is very extremely important to build that dialogue. Most of us probably have solutions, but since we don't come together and express them, we probably don't get to the right sort of outcome. So it's been a great experience. It's still, I would say, early days. We can do a lot, but I'm very happy with the kind of progress that we have seen. So yeah, we owe a lot to all our partners and ecosystem players who made this happen.
And thank you, Hemendra, for all those insights about your learnings from the agri-tech sector. And I hope we can co-opt them into our nascent smart protein sector. We've come down to the final question of our podcast. And I want to know, what do you think we will be feeding ourselves in the year 2050? And what do you envision a day in your life looking like in that year?
That's very futuristic. But yeah, let me make a few bold statements. So I think 2050, like almost 30 years from now, what I'm very confident that we'll move to some sort of personalized food or tailor-made food for each one of us, right? Depending on our taste, depending on our immunity, depending on our body mass index, blah, blah, blah. So I think that personalized food, personalized nutrition will become mainstream. There'll be a lot of tech solutions. I'm very confident that right from sowing to production to harvesting to post-harvest to right the from there to wholesaler to retailer to consumer, everything will be digitized. Whatever we can think of will be digitized somewhere. And hopefully that digitization will help a lot to bring a lot of efficiency and transparency in the entire food supply chain. There's a good probability I may have a spectrometer integrated in my iPhone, and while I'm eating a loaf of bread, I just click a picture and it throws up how much protein, fat, carbohydrate I'm consuming by eating it. And let's say before I go to sleep, it's quite possible I can look at my daily balance sheet of what I've consumed and sort of recalibrate my consumption of food for the next day or next few weeks. So I think it's going to become a lot of tech driven, particularly post COVID. I think a lot of these changes are going to get accelerated. Accountability in food supply chain, traceability, where the food is going to come from. There's so much of adulteration in the supply chain right now, in milk, in many food products. I think that, of course, has to be sorted out on priority. But I believe by the time we reach 2050, it will be very, very efficient, demand-driven, tech-enabled food supply chain, which we'll see. I think we will figure out a business models which can do direct correlation between what we consume and what has gone into it. So again, going back to Varun's question on climate risk and climate challenges, it's very clear we are borrowing from the next generation, right? So we need to build that accountability that whatever we are eating, how much natural resources has gone into it. I'm sure by the time we hit 2050, we should be able to establish that model between input and output, which hopefully will create a lot of awareness around responsibility to preserve natural resources. So I'm hopeful that that should happen in the next 30 years. I think from a farmer perspective also, he'll know what exactly to grow, when to harvest, when to sell. I believe there'll be a lot of automation. I think that's next big wave I see. Anyway, we are seeing a lot of issues around farm labor, even in the current crisis. My guess is we are going to see a lot of automation in agriculture, be it around sowing, be it around pest management, be it around post-harvest solutions. There's a lot of automation is going to sort of come into it. It's quite possible farmers in 2050 can do farming sitting anywhere, even remotely from home. That's pretty much possible. So all I can say that farming will become more exciting, more, if I can use the word, more glamorous for everyone to engage in. Probably not many people will believe me today, but I can say that farming will become a profession or an occupation which will excite a lot of people like you and me to go back to villages and do it ourselves. It will become an exciting opportunity for a lot of professionals. As I always say, I'm born as a consumer, but I would prefer to die as a farmer. And I hope I can fulfill that dream when it is, let's say, 2050. I'll be 78 years by then, I guess. So yeah, I think all looks very positive. I feel I'm optimistic. I know we are going through a tough crisis and there's a lot of pessimism right now about the whole how the world is going to change. But I think in next 30 years, things will change for good. And I feel very strongly about it. As far as alternative proteins are concerned, all I can say with confidence that most of the alternative protein as of today, be it plant proteins or meat substitute, etc., will become mainstream proteins. I think that's a good ambition to have for us. As far as I think 30 years is a long period of time, right? And I think if we don't achieve that, we are not doing something right. So we should make sure that what we call all proteins today should be mainstream by the time we hit 2050.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Hemendra. And thank you so much for being on Feeding 10 Billion with us.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks, Varun. Thanks, Ramya. It's been a wonderful interaction for me, and I look forward to many such conversations in the future.
The Indian alternative protein ecosystem is seeing its first real green shoots. With the work we've been doing driving corporate partnerships, installing fundamental infrastructure at universities and private labs, and engaging with government bodies like the Ministry of Food Processing Industries, beginning to bear fruit. But if we're going to see a thriving market for smart protein, we need an ecosystem where a plant-based or cultivated meat entrepreneur can work with ingredients, investors, or talent pools which are primed and ready to service them at a moment's notice. We need 1,000 companies alongside us on the mission for smart protein. And partners like Hemendra Mathur, ThinkAg, and their network are a key piece of making that happen. We're looking forward to working with them over the next years and decades to build a more healthy, sustainable, and just agri-food system.
If you want to start a company in this space or are interested in learning more about this sector as a researcher or simply want to collaborate, please do reach out. You can also join our GF Ideas India Smart Protein Innovation community on LinkedIn or follow us on social media. We are at Good Food India on Twitter and the Good Food Institute India on Instagram. And we leave our LinkedIn URL in our description.
If you like this podcast, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can listen to us on the IVM Podcast app or ivmpodcasts.com. You can also follow us on our social media. We are at IVM Podcasts on Twitter and Instagram. And if you want to reach out to me, I am at Varun D7 on Twitter and at Varun5 on Instagram. You can come ask me why.
And if you want to reach out to me, I'm Cryptic Caprice on Twitter and Dithering Funambulist on Instagram. Please don't ask me why. We look forward to having you with us every week. And of course, if you'd like to be part of accelerating the future of our food system, please just get in touch. You can email us at india@gfi.org.
My name is Varun Deshpande, Managing Director at the Good Food Institute India.
And I'm Ramya Ramurthy, the Communications Specialist at the Good Food Institute India. And you have been a part of Feeding 10 Billion Season 2.
Advertising is dead. Yep, you heard me right. Advertising is dead. We're all in the content business now. Let's not call it news, TV, radio, etc., etc. It's all content, and we're in the middle of this weirdly exciting phase where all the borders and lines that have been drawn over decades has been swept away by this lovely thing called the internet. We're a show where we don't dwell on just the stuff that is now, but rather the wider stuff about advertising, media, content, and the whole goddamn circus surrounding it. Tune in every Tuesday for our weekly unboxing of the mystery box we used to call advertising. I'm Varun Dugirala, co-founder and content chief at The Glitch, and this is my new podcast, Advertising is Dead.
Namaskar, dear Bandhu. My name is Ashish Vidyarthi. These are truly challenging times, and in these times, we need hope. Do take time to listen to my podcast, Begin the Journey. Available on IVM Podcasts, website, app, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Remember, there is hope because there's one life and we are alive.